4 of Tech Engineering Lounge. I'm Camy Pandari. Along with me, I've got James SP, and we have our first guest for this season, Prae. Welcome. How are you?
Hello, good, thank you.
So Prae is a UX engineer at Xero with a big focus on accessibility. I don't know much about UX engineering. I'm assuming, James, you're in the same boat. So that's why we've got Prae here with us today to teach us what UX engineering is all about. So Prae, you've been at Xero for like 4+ years now. Do you want to tell us what you do at Xero and what your role is like at Xero?
Cool. So first of all, at Xero, we don't have front-end engineering. All our job titles for front-end and full stack engineers are just engineers. We lump them all in the same circle. So my job title officially at Xero is just a lead engineer. And I have been at Xero for 4 years, and I've floated around different parts of the product. But in the end, I did come into Xero with a specialty, which is actually just what traditional front-end used to be, like the UI layer, translating design to code, all that jazz. But in the product land, it's no longer pages, right? Everything's dynamic. Like you have a page load, then components load, and things inside the page interact with each other. And therefore, the paradigm shifted a little bit. So that can no longer be the way we define, front-end and UX engineering. Now, at Xero, we are currently defining front-end as, the stacks, right? If front-end is a list of tools, it's HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and things in the browser and client side. But because the web has moved on so far now, like we could do so much more with JavaScript. That is, like if we're creating a template for a page, we don't have to call the database to get HTML generated and then output it into the page, right? All of that happens in the virtual DOM using React framework or any Vue.js or Angular, any other tools like that. And because a lot of that templating things and have now moved to the front end, the role of front-end devs have expanded. Where before we used to have a very limited scope of what we do in their user interaction, and then we throw it over the fence, and here's like the rest of the backend devs then interpolate those templates, interpolate them. So now that the paradigm has shifted, how do I ensure that how do I grow as a front-end person? And I can't focus on everything in the stack, right? I can't be an expert in GraphQL and all the React rendering and everything that happens in the browser. And that the tech just moved too fast there. Yep. And my heart has always been on the UI design and UX side. And therefore, how do I differentiate myself and clarify that, look, I don't do all of what the front-end stack has to offer. I can do it, but I'm not going to be any good at JavaScript architecture. So don't pull me into those conversations, but pull me into the conversations where designers are working out what are those micro interactions there are. What are the browser limitations related to drag and drop designs? And what are the accessibility considerations? How are users using the keyboard? So for me, I could still be on the design, understand the user interaction side while implementing them accurately to the highest possible quality on the front-end code side. And so that's a very long-winded way to kind of explain UX engineering in a nutshell. It's you defined as user interaction practices and applying responsive design and inclusive design principles to the highest possible standards at the most scalable way possible.
You are also a big evangelist for accessibility testing, and that's how I got to know about you first. If you recall, because Fabio was saying this to me recently, you did a talk for our meetup group called Wellington Testers, probably 4 years ago. And Fabio was telling me about it last week after the conference, and he was like, how nice and how humble is Prae. She did a talk for us where there were only 6 people, and today she spoke in front of 200 people at New Zealand Testing Conference. So it was a delight to have you at the conference, and your talk was amazing. So thank you for hanging out with us at the conference. You also have your podcast coming soon. Do you want to tell us about what your podcast is about?
Yep. So I'm learning to get better at speaking about accessibility to, more people on different sides of web creation. And so that's why I'm making a limited season podcast called Web Access Club. I'm going to do it in English first and then redesign the content to create a Thai version of the podcast later next year. And so I'm in the middle of fine-tuning the theme and the contents that go into each episode. I'll pre-record all of them and then slowly release them one by one. Hopefully by the end of August, the first episode will start coming out.
That is so cool. Sweet as. I'm keen to kick into the main content of today's episode. James, are you good with it?
Oh, I'm good with it. I'm ready to go.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, let's go. So, Prae, you've already explained us what UX engineering is. I probably want to also understand what UX engineering is not. So maybe just again a little bit like what is UX engineering and what is UX engineering not?
Okay, cool. Definitely what it is.
Yeah.
User interaction with scale. Because we're the final implementers of designer's vision. The designer could design the most accessible user experience possible, but it's us who implement it in the way that meets those vision or expand beyond those visions or meet the edge cases in what the users could do or how users access the web, right? They might be on the cheapest possible mobile phone. They might be a tinier screen than our designers are designing for. They might be resizing your app to half the size you think it was going to be because they're on a big laptop or small laptop and they have another piece of work on the side. So that's what it is. Like, how do we make sure that the design scales in that way? For what it is not just pushing pixels. It is not just we just like, here's this front-end developer, you sit down, you do the CSS, we make a responsive design, that's fine. We make things look pretty. That's not what we are. That's why it's UX and not UI engineering, right? Engineers are supposed to look at how to make sure things are sustainable, scalable, safe, all these other considerations beyond just writing and cutting code. And the reason why I put UX into there is because, well, I'm making sure that experience for the user also scales with it. So I think, it is not the tools we use.
This is good because you mentioned working with a designer, and because I've not heard the term UX engineer before. And so I'm curious what the relationship is with someone who's, I guess, working in UI design. How much design skills do you have to have, or, do you have to have? How much design skills do you have to do a good job of what you're doing, and how much crossover is there, and how much conflict is there in that sort of role?
From how I see it is that designers and UX engineers are supposed to be each other's best friends. We're each other's source of growth because I understand user interaction as deeply as I could without stepping into the research realm or continuously consuming user stories in an in-depth way designers are expected to do, or understand what are the psychological things that we're dealing with in order to apply this design for our use cases. Like I stop there, right? I understand our user use cases into stories. I understand who our users are. I understand how to implement properly, but I'm not going to go into like the rationales to why this particular shade of blue is actually more user-friendly than another shade, right? I mean, sure, colors is a big thing, right? But there's other things too, like font sizes, the style, the things that are in detail, or the layout. We're not going to go into that, but I can challenge the designer and go, right, based on how I can code this, I know your layout is left and right here, these two elements. Did you say that the one on the right was supposed to appear first when it's responsive? How would you like that to be coded? Is that the experience? Like, why is the experience from a single linear view different than when it's a wider screen? So I feel like by designers designing an ideal experience, I can then push that further. I can go, okay, when we're loading 5 components onto the page from third-party providers, what should that look like? What should that announce like at the screen reader? What are the details? When designers are designing, right, often they're designing with like the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, but they don't know all the worst possible case scenario. For them, it's like, should the whole page load or stop loading altogether when this particular feature fail? I can then force the designer to think more about the edge cases where the designers are not necessarily going to sit down and think about, because they don't know how the micro front ends are loading or how the iframes are having problems. All they know is this whole page load or this component loads. So I feel like by us working closely with each other, we can really push each other's growth. I can then start preempting the design and go, okay, in your past life, your loading state looks like this, but you design it differently in this thing. Was that intentional or not? Or should we line up with another product who have already solved this problem, but you may not be aware of it? And so, by helping each other out, I can just be a better and more conscious developer.
And does it ever sort of go the other way as well? Sort of, you sort of see, you take your designs and, you expand on them. Do you ever have to sort of cut scope and go, hey, you've produced this great design, but we can't build it because it's going to be too much of a performance hit or something?
Well, exactly that. That would be a conversation, right? Because when I work with a designer who's not just performance, but perhaps accessibility is an easier thing that I do, I would go, all right, I look at this design and I already know immediately that the screen reader users are not going to hear that validation if it sits at the top of the error. Or it might hear it, but they would hear it before they hit the field. So does that make sense? I can then start questioning those and go, hey, here's a challenge. Here's more user scenarios that you have not considered. Could you also include those user scenario? So it's not that your design is wrong, but it's just that we happen to know more scenario that you might not be aware of. And therefore, can you please go and let's collaborate together and find the best way. We've had to cut scope before as well. In some of the works we do, right, we're on tight deadline for certain features, we have to deliver. But in that case, the conversation was, what are the things that would critically stop the user from moving on to their next task? So I would ask the designer, what is the user's jobs to be done on this particular flow? And which one of your features are really the things that we need to have in order to say, yes, that needs to be shipped, and everything else is a lovely enhancement to then get us from AA standards to perhaps AAA and beyond.
Mentioning job to be done is it's one of my key things. It's like, oh yeah, there's something we should link to that in the notes. Anyway, sorry, Camy, go.
No, you're good. Prae, on the same note, what I am a little bit confused and not clear about, and I think our listeners can relate to, is what is the difference between a UX engineer versus a UI engineer and a front-end engineer? Are they all the same things, or they're like different niches under the same umbrella? If you could touch up on all three of them, that would be really much appreciated.
I think if you look at a historical standpoint, right, UI developer, UI engineer are kind of the same, right? Like even just front end used to just covers everything in around that, not design, but like the anything developer ending side. But with the design, there also used to be just one designer who do both research and UI design, and sometimes they also touch a bit of front end code, and it's kind of fluid, right? Back in the smaller scale day and everyone can do whatever they want kind of day. But you find that as the company scales and we need to look at more scenarios and more requirements, once you add security in, you can't really expect designer who knows how to code CSS to start looking at things like that. Then how do we, which part of the stack is then that needs to be included in? Like whose job is it? And so we started splitting, all right, in the end, UI engineer and UX engineer might be very similar, and UI designer and UX designer might be very similar, but I'm always cautious to use the word UI because historically UI has always been just a pure visuals.
Yeah.
Right. And that's for both developer and designer. And they've started moving away from that and turned that into a product design role or UX design role is because we no longer want you to focus on pushing pixels and just looking at things visually. We want you to look at the whole experience. When the user land on this thing, regardless of which tool they're using to access your app, what is the experience like? Map that out and design for that. And hence why I'm saying like UX, that's why like we no longer use UI really. We're trying to use UX. And in terms of the difference between UX engineer and design, then that's there will be overlap, but the main spectrum of the job is more user understanding psychology of how the experience come to be, and then more on how do we make sure the code integrates well with the modern coding standards, with security implementation and things like that.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah. So how is, I mean, from majority of the organizations that I've worked with, I've never heard UX engineering or UX engineers before, though the most common one are front-end engineers. And when you talk about front-end, it's like web front-end and then mobile front-end. Is it still the same thing? Like, or is it like when you say UX engineering, is it different I'm guessing it's different in terms of mobile and like web as well, right? Or is it?
Yeah, so this is where I'm just tired of the way the industry define front-end as a whole. So in the ideal world, right, I can just say front-end and it would mean both the UX side of things in coding and the things around like React application, JavaScript application, architecture and things like that. But because that the scope of what we own is so huge, a front-ender in any company, when you talk to them, you'll find two different types of front-enders, right? The people who are front of the front stack, which is like me, design, interaction, accessibility, templating, and the people in the back of the front-end stack, which is like GraphQL, the how do we deal with performance loading, and again, security implementation. Of course, all of us need to know both of these things, but one person can't really be a specialist in both of these spectrum at the scale we want it to be. And so, yes, I would like to just say I'm a front-ender, but if I go look for a job now, all the jobs would be pretty much a JavaScript developer as a job description. And it ignores or devalues anything else on the front-to-front-end stack.
Yeah.
We've talked before about the difference between, have we talked about it before? I've talked about it before, the difference between programmers and engineers, right? And it almost feels like you're talking about, you know, when we talk about front-end, the term kind of becomes synonymous with someone who cuts code for front-end, whereas what we want is an engineer that is actually doing that but thinking beyond the scope of that stuff as well. Is it a fair kind of parallel?
I think, yes, because I mean, that's engineer versus developer, right? Or developer or engineers versus programmer. And so for this case, it's specific to front-end practice. And so it's what's involved, what is defined under that practice. And it encompasses all of the interactions or the UX of the user. And because it's not currently defined as the UX interaction of the user inside the front-end umbrella where the market is hiring right now, I had to go and force that in so that people stop posting job for me to say, hey, I have a React application role. I'm like, yeah, I can do React, but I don't really want to be cutting React code all the time and using other front-end framework with no designer with me. Like my work is more valuable or more fulfilling for me when I do work closely with designers and push each other's boundaries.
Yeah. It definitely sounds like more like a niche, and like I personally like people having expertise, and that's why I'm not quite comfortable with like just like all engineers doing everything, because like they're just kind of like I'm just still not comfortable. We will do an episode on this, James. Interesting conversation we have too. But yeah, it sounds pretty cool and like very niche. How is the market like? I mean, you've touched upon it a little bit. I'm keen to understand like what is the market or job scope like for UX engineers in Wellington, and then in New Zealand, and then globally.
So in Wellington and New Zealand, it is pretty much non-existent, or at least if you're saying a UX developer or a front-end developer who has the skill set more of a UX engineer, they're on an agency side, you know, like the people who make all those pages for business and static pages, or in agencies where the value of user interaction is higher, then perhaps like the long-term code stability, it might be a one-off project or short-term project for agencies. And because the projects are like that, naturally the pay is lower for front-end developers in general. Actually, front-end developers historically been undervalued anyway, because we were defined as people who code HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. How hard is HTML and CSS and JavaScript? Though no one does it well.
Is that true? Because I always thought that would be a lot harder than some of the back-end or API work. Maybe I don't know. I find it all hard, actually.
Well, I find JavaScript these days are hard. Like, I'm struggling to keep up with the current state. But HTML and CSS has this stigma for the longest time of, because it's a declarative programming languages where you declare something is red. You don't have to do loops or logic. You can do it in some areas, but you don't. You declare something H1, H2, links, buttons. Because it is declarative, it is seen as simpler and easy, which is true, right? And to be fair, you can sit down and learn HTML and CSS in a day. You can. But to do it well and to understand how to scale it and understand how different tools and screen readers and mobile applications are reacting with it, that's another layer of depth. So you now have to dive into UX interaction and understanding the user, where not all programmers or people who code want to jump into that side of the fence. They want to then turn this into, in that case, it's not a real programming language. And therefore it's not like it's this unknown, right? It's scary, it's hard to learn, or don't understand CSS. So I prefer to do SQL and stuff, something that's seen as more traditional, hardcore programming. And it's also that anything in front-end practice is not really taught formally in university. Most of the people who do front-end these days are self-taught or have to jump to projects that use these tooling to create user interaction. Because computer science are going to be logic, code. Tests for grads are going to be, here's a data table of the stats. Work out how many coffee this company drinks in one day. And that doesn't have anything to do with user interaction or design or UX, understanding the user. And so because it's not understood well, it's not valued historically. And when you translate that to the market these days, you end up with more people who knows how to do responsive design and all these stuff happen to be low paid in agencies. And they find it impossible to jump into the product land, because the criteria of a good engineering product is you know how you write, you test code, which is great, right? You want to do it. But to get in, you have to already know how to test code, how to do things at scale, X, Y, Z, which does not cover anything in their skill set. So if you want to step to the product market in New Zealand, you might as well start advertising yourself as JavaScript developer, go learn React or something, then you'll get into the product land. So that's New Zealand market. Yeah. In terms of international, Australia is a little bit more understanding. There have been a lot of companies who are shipping very visual heavy products at scale, Atlassian and all those stuff, who are conscious of this and have established proper front-end practices and UX design practices. And therefore, they'll hire for these people and understand that, yes, we can retrain them. Anyone can be trained into testing after they get into the right environment, have the right guidance. For the US, it has already specialized. So when a company is operating in the US market, you can't just advertise engineer anymore, because that would mean basically back-end people who knows a little bit of JavaScript. That's a definition of a full-stack developer. Yeah. So if you want people who knows interaction, you hire front-end engineers. So that's already an established thing in the overseas market.
There is such a really good point, because when I was doing research for this episode, and I just put in what is UX engineering on YouTube, all the videos that came up were all American, hardly any Aussie or any videos from local community. So that's actually a really good point. Talking about that stigma thing that we were talking about, do you think web or web front end developers it's not that hard because it's people usually end up comparing web front end with mobile front end, like more and more B2C applications are now mobile nowadays, right? Web is mostly B2B. And even though like JavaScript, Kotlin, and Swift, they're all functional languages. And once you know one, you can easily kind of like start doing another. But mobile is still a bit more niche than web. And if you look at the salaries, I think the mobile developer salaries are still a bit higher than web. What are your thoughts on that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I feel like because the web itself is designed to be more accessible to more users, right? I mean, you could turn up a web page in your was it the little Kobo app, black and white, you can still scroll through web pages, but you can't open apps. So there's no like licensed proprietary thing attached to learning how to code for the web or learning how to use the web, right? Browsers come pre-shipped with anything. Yep. When it comes to mobile app, there's almost this layer of access control for both people who create apps and people who access apps.
Publish.
So if you're on the Apple environment, it breaks that down even further. You have to be of a certain demographic who choose to use Apple devices and have enough purchasing power to purchase some of these apps to then install it and use it. The bar for technical knowledge for users is much higher. And same as a user, right? In order to get things through the App Store, we all see the pain of that, right? Through the request process, approval, security checks, all that stuff. And you already have to have Xcode, which means you, as a developer, you probably have to have a Mac, and therefore that's a different bar. Now, developing IO for Android is, I guess, like a little bit more open, but at the same time, it is still a propriety-ish thing. And yes, it is not taught in university the same way Frontend is not taught in university, but at the same time, because of the nicheness of how people are learning these things. And I think when I realized that the web is free by default, right? You would open the browser, so you can't really monetize that. But for companies to offer an app or a service, you are geared towards monetizing it, which means users expect to do more than just browsing through content. You need to be to interact with it and things. And so it does require more knowledge of user interaction on the front-end side and understanding the ecosystem of that. So as a developer, you have to marry yourself to one or both the ecosystem and understand all those use cases in order to implement it properly. So that's a long way of saying,
There's heaps in there.
Too many things.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that I just, for one, anyone that says, like I can remember, like, I forget who I was talking to, but comparing these complicated SQL queries we were all writing and then trying to center a div on a page. And that was way harder. And people underestimate, like how difficult some of that front-end tech stuff is. I'm interested you touch on, because I don't think they teach front-end, I keep saying front-end, sorry, but UI design, UI engineering.
Well, no, any front-end is not really taught. So you're right, any front-end practice.
I think dev academies are doing a better job of that now, and we've had some good results from them, and we'll probably talk about that more and more, right, as what's coming out of dev academy. And anyone now that wants to get into engineering, like, that's definitely a good path. University is a good path too, don't get me wrong, but with different things and you get different stuff out of them, and if you want a 6 month in, then it's a really good path. I want to get this in before we use up too much time, because we talked a little bit about, when I think about UX, I think about usability, but you're also sort of a specialist in accessibility. And these are two things that I've kind of treated separately in the past. Usability is about how you use the thing. Accessibility is about, making it accessible to everyone. But I feel like the more as you started talking about this, there's quite a bit of crossover there. Am I right? What's sort of your philosophy there?
Oof. So First of all, clarification, I'm not yet a specialist. I'm working to become one. So like, otherwise people will be like, Prae's saying this wrong. And I'm like, no, I'm still learning.
Sure. Yeah. You're more of a specialist than I am. So,
More than me.
Yeah. So yes, from my point of view, a usable experience is an accessible experience. For me, like if it's an umbrella of inclusive design and creating a best user experience possible, accessibility is just one other subset of that. But because it is so not talked about until recently, or there's not enough awareness of it, we had to turn it into a separate bucket of things. But in reality, right, it's like the diversity and inclusion thing. I shouldn't need to really consciously think, I go into this meeting and there's how many males and females or non-binary people, right? It should just be a part of the way we work, a part of the way we think about workforce and systems and support. But it is not. And therefore, we need to create a bucket and a label and dedicated resource to get it up to a certain standard or a certain acknowledgement and awareness before it can then be blurred back into the fold again. And that's how I see accessibility and inclusive design. To the most beautiful and usable user experience is also an accessible one.
Oh,
so beautiful.
Can we get a quote for the...
Exactly. You have to exactly. I'm going to put it on the show notes in caps.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
That was beautiful, Prae. So for someone starting off fresh, how can they become a UX engineer? Like if like people who will listen to this podcast or watch other YouTube videos on UX engineering, and they are just trying to get into the industry, how can they become a UX engineer? Or if there is a front-end developer, let's say a web front-end developer who's never, UX engineering has never piqued his or her interest, but now it does. So how can they make that shift as well? So,
okay.
Yeah.
This is something that's been on my mind for the longest time, because if you want to hire more UX aware engineers, we have to find a pipeline that works for them, right? Yes. And so the things that we feel that people are not able to get into the companies that are able to let them grow in UX engineering. So speaking of that would be medium size and above companies, because small companies wouldn't have the capacity, right? Startup wouldn't just care. They would just like throw everything in there, try to get it to work. Exactly. We'll specialize later. So first, if you already are a front-end dev and you really enjoy working with designers and UX, so first of all, make sure you enjoy these things, because otherwise it'll be a world of pain, right? So first, enjoy those things. In that case, next is to look for a role that lets you grow your engineering attributes that you don't usually get to learn in the current role that lets you do front-end development. Speaking of unit testing, the understanding DevOps, understanding how to make sure your code scales, perhaps your pattern library that you have. Imagine if more like 4,000 devs are using that. How do we make sure the documentation is established? Do we do do's and don'ts from the design perspective? How do we provide guidance around that? So that's like a baby step starting point, right? Something you're already doing, but put more engineeringness around it. The keyword is scale, security, and accessible to other developers. So once you get that rounded off, you should then start to pass those engineering assessments, the standardized one that you have in other companies. Those are the guiding point, right? You have to get your foot to the door before you start specializing. And that's the reality of it. You would not be able to rock up to a place and not do any of those assessments or do a different sets that would highlight your skills. It doesn't exist right now. So have to learn those attributes, understand monitoring, SLO, all those things that standard engineers are supposed to be able to do. And once you're in, then carve that path, right? Talk the heck out of UX to your dev team, right? Ask them to do keyboard interaction. Ask them like, hey, have you considered responsive? Or, responsive is more than just resizing your browser. It is actually making sure your settings allow for user. Dark mode is one of the examples. Only once you're in, you can start advocating and talking about it. And once you're in, make those connections with your designers, like be their best friends and go to them for any cross-cutting initiative, right? If there are things that are being designed that are covering more than just your team, go to those meetings, be the subject matter experts in even a specific component and all the interactions involved in those. And that would be how I would recommend people start now. It's a shame that there's no like bucket that you can just hop into. You have to sort of weasel your way in. But that's the best advice I could give right now.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that way, the product management, right? 10, 15 years ago, you'd invent that role, and now they're everywhere. So, yeah.
Yeah, but it's the same in the quality space as well. Like you start as a manual tester, like on front end or API or anything, and then when you start talking about automation, you really have to become a bit more niche. So it's pretty much like, I think it's pretty practical advice, Prae, that you gave. And people would appreciate it totally. Yeah, James, do you have any questions for Prae? Any more questions?
I mean, we didn't dive into UX research at all, and I don't know if we have time to, but, that's a whole big, how much do you get tied into that? Because the closest I get is sitting on interviews sometimes, and maybe it's a bigger topic than for today, but how important is it to be on that side of things as well?
I feel like yes and no. I feel like if your guiding post is to understand how are users using your tool and what are they using to access it, then you can work backwards from there. You might not need to be in all of those interviews, but you already see a list of, here's a published report internally on this particular research. The user is on Windows 5 versions behind, on Internet Explorer because they're not allowed to install a new thing. And so we already get these requirements, right? And you work backwards from there. So yes, it would be nice to watch some of those user interviews, but if you're really short for time and you want to get started, look for those guiding posts, the use cases. Then learn what you can around those use cases.
Yep, that's great. And so 5 or 6 years ago, Don't Make Me Think was the book to read if you want to learn UX stuff. Is that still a thing?
It still is. Some of the examples are dated, right? But the concept is still the same. And it's not just about simplicity. I want to then add The New Responsive by Una, who is one of the developer advocates around CSS and Frontend at Google. We can post a link in the show note. Yes. And she has a big post, an article, and a video on what is the updated definition of responsive now. To be usable, you also respond to users' needs in form factor and in the context of the user and in their jobs to be done. And with those in mind, it makes up the current state.
Perfect. That's awesome. All right, that's all my questions. I will limit myself there.
I just have one quick question before we move into the trick question segment and wrap this up. So there is a big movement for low code or no code tools nowadays. Is that something that impacts UX engineering as well? I mean, it obviously impacts all front-end development and stuff, but is there any kind of crossover with UX engineering? Does it make your job harder or easier? Does it contribute in any way, or what's the scope they like?
Well, I believe in the right tools for the job, right? If you're making a site for a bakery, do you need a front-end engineer to do your stuff and then hire someone for a one-pager? Probably not. And so low code, no code, there's going to be places for those, right? For people. And so it is important that people who makes the low code to no code tool makes all of these UX practices, accessibility practices pre-shipped for those users to the best of their abilities. Now, this is one of the reasons why we need to move away from being a developer and becoming more of an engineer. Because again, we're working with custom cases with more security and in-depth concerns. So the deeper you go into engineering practices, the more you're safeguarding against, I guess, what people are fearing, that low code, no code can take away jobs from front-end developer. I'm well, it will, but only do you want your future to be shipping one-pager website for small businesses? Probably not. You're probably going to look at how do we make sure my things scale? How do we create that low code to no code tool rather than being the consumer side?
Yeah. And I mean, that all goes back to like being an expert in your field and having niche knowledge, right? Like you make a career out of like your niche knowledge. That's why people listen to you, right? That was really good. Now we are moving on to the trick question segment for the day. James, do you have a question for Prae?
I mean, I don't know about a trick question, but here's a question. I've got a spare 2 hours tomorrow. What can I do to improve the accessibility of my product?
Have you tabbed through it? I think that's the first thing, right? Hey, try using, like, disable your mouse if it's Bluetooth or unplug it. And if you can navigate the whole thing using your keyboard, sure. For mobile apps, keyboard's not a thing, right? In that case, the hurdle there is a little bit harder because I don't know how to test it in an easy way. Because all mobile devices does come pre-shipped with a screen reader, and that's a high bar. So maybe start with even just color contrast. There should be a black and white or high contrast mode in your phone or in your app. Flip that on and see whether you can still use your stuff. Does the images all disappear into the black void of high contrast mode? Or perhaps in black and white, you can't really tell the difference between that red and green status from your mobile app. Start small, something that you can really access more easily.
Genuinely, that tab order, like I know that, and I haven't done it for ages, and like I promise you, I'm going to do that tomorrow. Yep.
Thank you.
Nice. So my question is, if you were not a UX engineer, what would you be doing now? What would you be a niche expert at?
Oh, that's a hard question. I'm a shitty designer, so no, I'm not going to design. I understand how to speak the language, but just start me out, ask me to design stuff. It's just going to be plain as heck. So actually, I would be an expert in Thai historical food research.
It is so niche. It is super niche than what you do right now. Tell us more about it.
Oh man, well, perhaps not just Thai, but just a lot of Asian sweets. Because sugar doesn't exist everywhere in the world prehistoric time, right? Or even if like sugar is not a thing that exists in every single culture. Not everyone can grow sugar cane. In that case, what are the other sources of sugar out there? In Thailand, it would be palm sugar, it would be coconut sugar. So you can tell if when a dessert was invented or like loosely the time frame based on the ingredients that goes in there. And you can also tell the classes of people who consume those desserts based on if it's a refined sugar or white sugar recipe, chances are it's a palace desserts. So desserts made for kings and queens, and it's going to be very highly ornate, very pretty in shape, where the local desserts or the ones you made at home would be like in a bean soup with coconut cream on top. So I find that interesting, and I've always looked at it in the background.
That's epic.
Now I'm hungry, and I'm also we went out for dinner last night, and they messed up our desserts, and I'm still bitter about it. Anyway, it's not.
Desserts.
Maybe I'll get some dessert for us tonight. Yeah.
That was a really, really great answer. I don't think anyone can top that.
Who knows?
Prae, I know. Thank you so much for being here today. It is a pleasure always to talk to you. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to point out to the hoodies that me and James are wearing. We should have told you before. This was not planned at all. We just happened to wear the hoodies. These are the hoodies from NZ Testing Conference that happened a couple of weeks ago, where all three of us spoke. It was epic. I'm gonna put links to all of our talks in the show notes. But thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure, and we'll definitely have you back at some stage. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we will see you guys very soon. Bye for now.
Thank you, Prae.